All right, tonight, Mr. Jim Bertrand, speaking on the Shroud of Turin. Our presenter has taught high school science for 39 years with a master's degree in education. He and his wife have 6 adult children and have been married for 42 years. Let's go. I've only got 35 to go. They reside in Lincoln, Nebraska, where they attend St. Peter Catholic Parish. He's been invited to give this presentation across 30-plus states in the past 11 years, including Canada and New Zealand. This is our first international speaker, everybody. Wow. His mission is to provide factual information on the Holy Shroud for the edification of souls and the greater glory of God. And he wants you to know that he does not make any money from doing this. He's happy to be here. And any funds that you do donate, he'll mention that in the during his talk, are going to go to the organization which he'll allude to here in a moment. But everybody, if you could welcome Mr. Jim Bertrand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. You got me on now? All right. I have prayed a novena for each one of you these last 9 days, that we'd open our hearts to, what is the message that God wants to send each of us through contemplating his image on the shroud. And the tone of this presentation is not going to be limited to science alone. We're a body and a soul. And by uniting truth with the human heart, we can nurture both. This talk will be an overview of this most recently completed, very comprehensive book on the Shroud. Dr. John Jackson spent over 40 years accumulating information on the Shroud, and this presentation will be an overview of that. I think it's the most factual, comprehensive Shroud book in the world today, and you'll get a glimpse of what's in there. Here's the format we're going to follow. Okay, well, let's begin with an introduction to how the body of Jesus would have been wrapped in the shroud in accordance with Jewish practices. The body would be placed on one end of a long sheet that you see there, wrapped around his head, and then both open ends would be down here at the feet. Now, how are you going to keep that on the body? After it's folded over the body, you take a long strip, about 3 inches wide. They tie it at the chin. It would spiral around the body 3 times, and then tie it off down here at the feet. And that way you could carry the body, and the shroud would stay on top of it. And I gave a talk recently, and a funeral director came up to me and said, well, yeah, we recently had a Jewish burial, and they're still doing this. They've been doing this for thousands of years. I invite you to read this from the Gospel of Mark. And down here we see the artist's rendition of Good Friday, the body being taken down, laid on the shroud, as you see, both open ends down at the feet. And then after the resurrection, there's the back side and front side of the body imprinted, as you see up here. So the question is the Shroud of Turin, this shroud spoken of in the Gospels, and what is the evidence to support that? Now here's a closer look at it. Because of the lighting over here, it's very dim to see anyway, so it's kind of lit up better here for you to see. The shroud itself is 14 feet 3 inches long, which is what you see over here, actual size, by 3 feet 7 inches. And that is exactly 8 cubits by 2 cubits. The Syrian cubit at the time is 21.7 inches. So it's 2 cubits by 8 cubits. It's at that type of dimension. It's not inches and feet in terms of the way the scale is. And what we see here is these brown lines here. Those are from a fire in 1532. And these are the patches that were used to cover up the holes from that fire. And what we're going to do is we're going to divide the shroud into 2 parts. So from the left here, we're going to take that left side of the shroud, which corresponds from here to here. And then we're going to rotate it for you. So there's what you see is on your left side of the shroud here. I think everyone can see the face there. There's the scorch marks from the fire. We see the hands here. That blood there is the exit wound. The nail, that's where the nail would have exited the body, be up against the cross. The entrance wound is an open question. These are water stains that were there long before that fire of 1532. Forensics tells us the man in the shroud was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed about 170 pounds. What you see right here, that is a blood stain. We believe that is the blood that gushed forth when the lance went through his lung and his heart. They were checking to make sure he was dead. That is the blood stain you see there next to this triangular patch there. All right, now let's go to the back side, which is the right side. He's laying down looking up at you. Here's his head. At the back of his head, imagine his face is facing you. There's his shoulders, his legs. There's blood coming off the right foot and the left foot there. So here is the right side of the shroud for you. Those blood stains there indicate it was not just a nice round ringlet, it was more of a cap. They probably took 3 or 4 reeds and twisted them together in a ring, and then you could branches of 2 different kinds of thorn plants. So it was a cap, it was a helmet. There are the scourge marks across the back, and there's blood coming off a foot there and blood coming off a foot there, and these, of course, are the scorch marks. These holes right here are going to be significant. We'll get to them later. Now, this is a close-up of the shroud itself. The shroud is pure linen. Cotton and linen are 2 different cloths. And it looks like it's very rough here. This is magnified 32 times for you. And those are threads. Those threads are about the same size as the threads on your buttons. So the buttons on your shirt, about 1/3 of a millimeter. That's about the diameter of one of those. And here it is. It's called a very rare weave called the herringbone 3-in-1 weave. You go over 3 and under 1. And over 3 and under 1. And then you shift by 1 thread. So it produces this stair-step pattern that you see here. It's a very unique weave. It was never found in Europe at any time for linen, but it was found at the time of Christ in making this type of very expensive. This is more apt to be used for a Passover tablecloth than for a burial cloth. This would be like your best Christmas dinner tablecloth. Now what you see over there is what's called the cloth image. So this corresponds to what you're looking at right there. And then when you take a picture of that with an old camera, it looks like this over here. This is the photographic negative. And what's interesting is that the photographic negative inverts everything. So the dark nose becomes light. Now, that 3 was a blood stain. The blood stains went on by direct contact, but the image did not go on by direct contact. We'll get to that. Now, what happens is the body is over here, and when it imprints on the shroud is showing us a mirror image. So what looks like my right hand on the cloth was formed by my left hand. So whenever you're looking at the photographic negative, that's what the body would have really looked like. That blood stain would have looked like a 3. And when you impress it on the cloth and come back, it's an inverted 3. Notice there's no side images. And that's true for the whole body. So we'll have to answer that question when we get to the idea of how did the image form. We'll get to that. By the way, that's not the top of the head. That is a water stain. So that's not the top of the head. This is a flagrum. And there are currently 3 different flagrums on display in a museum in Rome. This one we believe is consistent with the wounds that we see on the shroud because the wounds from the scourging come in pairs, and you'll see that. This is one type of crucifixion nail, about 7 or 8 inches long. There's a second type of crucifixion nail that's been discovered. We'll get to it later. Now, the scourging was very severe. Count over 372 wounds. There are 159 wounds on the front of the body, 213 on the back from head to foot. So that number is actually low because there's no side images on the shroud. And certainly there would have been wounds on the side. So that number is an estimate that's low. See the ball there and the ball there from that flagrum? Ball there and there. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 50, verse 6, it says, I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard. If you look at his chin there, there's beard. What's that black circle there? The beard has been ripped out. Because the beard is against the cloth. It's showing up as a light color. And there's nothing there, which means there's no beard there. And my face I did not shield from buffets. If you look at his right cheek, it's different. Why is that? Well, there's a direct correlation between the cloth to body distance at the moment of image formation. So those parts of the body that were closest to the cloth are going to come out darker, like his nose and the beard. And of course, they're lighter over here. And the eyes were a couple millimeters away from the cloth, so they're going to be darker. But if you were struck in the face and your right cheek swelled, it would be tight up against the cloth. So that's why you see that right cheek being lighter in color. It shows significant swelling. So my point is, I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard, my face I did not shield from buffets. We know he was struck at his trial. The shroud is a physical manifestation of how that prophecy was fulfilled. Here's the backside of the body, and this corresponds to where the laser's at right here. We're looking at the upper half of the backside of his body. And of course, the photographic negative shows it so much better. There are the blood stains from the cap of thorn. Look at his hair. It goes all the way down to the shoulder blades, the scapulus. And it would be typical for Orthodox Jews of that time and even today that have long hair. So our Lord would have had long hair, and that's not unusual. These are patches, and these light lines are the dark scorch marks from the fire in 1532. Now, if we look at the contrast between these scourge marks here, they're just very clear, and the shoulder area. Well, if you had to get scourged and then had to carry a heavy beam across your shoulders, it was probably a single patibulum, about 6 feet long, weighing 60 to 90 pounds. The vertical stipes tended to stay in place because the Romans did so many crucifixions, they left the vertical pieces in place. Whether our Lord's feet was 1 foot or 3 feet above the ground, we don't know. But they would leave those vertical pieces in place. The criminals would have a horizontal patibulum tied around their wrists, and they'd be led to their crucifixion site. And when they fell and stumbled, there's no way to break your fall. So their knees hit the ground, their nose hit the ground, have to be helped up. And the patibulum is going to slide across your shoulders. So the point here is that the contrast between those clear scourge marks and the mutilated ones is consistent with the Gospels of a scourging followed by having to carry a heavy beam across one's shoulders. Now this is a close-up of the shroud right about there where the laser's at. There's some blood on the back there that had drained off from the lance wound when he was laying horizontal. Right? That's blood that came out of his chest. And notice how red it is still. And how can that be? Because if you know anything about blood, it'll turn black very quickly. So how is it that this blood can still be red after all these centuries? Well, in the 20th century, it was discovered that when a person suffers a severe trauma and loses 30 or 40 or 50% of their blood volume, then the body responds, that the liver produces an enzyme that goes into the blood and it busts up the red blood cells to speed up the reaction from the red blood cells to the body's tissues. This is the body's last-ditch effort to save itself. This byproduct that is created is called bilirubin. And bilirubin is kind of a yellow-orange product that gets in the blood. Once that blood, which is laden with bilirubin, leaves the body, it stays red till the end of time. So the point here is that this is not just blood from any man, because if it was, it'd be dark. This is blood from a man who suffered a severe trauma, and that's why the blood is still red. There's a second type of crucifixion nail that was unearthed outside the walls of Jerusalem. Now, if we stop to think of this unspeakable pain that our Lord endured by having nails going through his hands and feet, we begin to appreciate the great love he has for us. And as he contemplated this in the Garden of Gethsemane, he understood how this was going to feel. For you and me, it would be fear of the unknown. But the person of Jesus Christ has a human nature and a divine nature, always united. So his divine nature, with his human nature, he would have understood exactly how every cell and nerve of his body was going to respond to this torture. It would be fear of the completely understood. And can you imagine the terror? And this anxiety was so great that he sweat blood, a very rare condition known as hematidrosis. And hanging in this crucifixion position leads to extreme pain across the shoulders. And this was verified in some very well-supervised simulated crucifixion experiments by volunteer Air Force cadets at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. They were put in this crucifixion position with leather gloves and their feet in a leather stirrup, and they all complained how the cramping from wrist to wrist caused them to move and shift around. But of course, when you're moving up, you're pushing off on the nail that's going through your feet. Whether our Lord is breathing in or breathing out, he did not have one moment where he could escape that pain that he endured for us for 3 hours on the cross. Now, this is a close-up of the shroud on the darkest image-bearing fibers, the nose. The nose of the shroud is the darkest because that was the tightest against the cloth at the moment of image formation. And we believe that there was a burst of radiation that dehydrated the fibers and they've yellowed. And this gives you an idea how subtle it is. That quality of being very faint is called superficiality. Now, this is one thread, very tiny thread. And that thread is made up of anywhere from, this is magnified 64 times for you, maybe 70 to 120 individual fibrils making up one thread. Each of these is tinier in diameter than a human hair. And as you can see, it's very, very faint, isn't it? Well, to give you an idea just how superficial this is, we're going to chop off the end of that, and we're going to look at a cross-section of one of those threads. This is a cross-section of a single thread. From here to here is only 1/3 of a millimeter. Notice the yellowed area. That yellowed area corresponds to what is the image depth on one of these threads. And notice it does not even penetrate to the center of one of those microscopic fibrils. Now, the water stains and the blood stains and the scorch marks, they penetrate all the way through. Every single one of those circles would be solid yellow. But the image is only found in the outer boundary of that outer layer, 0.2 of a micron. And to give you an idea how tiny that is, a millimeter, that's about the thickness of a paper clip. There are 1,000 microns in 1 millimeter. And that's 0.2 of a micron. So the image depth is 1/5 of 1/1000th of 1 millimeter. That is a trait we cannot replicate today with all of our science. It's one of the many traits of the Shroud that makes it so mysterious. There's Dr. Jackson measuring the Shroud back in 1978. The Shroud is about 1/3 of a millimeter. And for those of you that play guitar, that is the number 6 string, the high E string. That's 1/3 of a millimeter in diameter. Same thickness. Next, we go to archaeology. These are the very steps that Jesus would have seen in his lifetime, both as a boy when he was 12 and got left behind, and as a man in his 30s. Now, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but these steps still remain in Jerusalem today as you see them. These are the famous steps of the south entrance to the temple. And what's interesting is this type of dirt is called travertine aragonite. It's a very rare type of limestone found only in Jerusalem and a handful of places on earth. And that particular limestone is found on the Shroud in 3 places: on the nose, and on the knees, and on the soles of the feet. 3 areas of our Lord's body that would have touched the ground on Good Friday are found on the Shroud, matching this Jerusalem dirt. Next we go to botany. This is the study of plants. That is Dr. Max Frey in Switzerland, and Ray Rogers, the chemist next to him. 1978, there's the real Shroud. Notice how good the coloration matches up with this replica. This picture was taken in 1978 by the Jewish photographer Barry Schwartz, and a lot of work went into making sure that this was exactly right, and he finally approved it. And when I purchased this in 2015, there were less than 50 copies of this in the world. There are now well over 100 of other kinds that people got on the internet, but they weren't made from Barry's pictures. So this one has a lot more detail. Now, in his hand, see that's a red tape dispenser from 3M Company. And what he did was he went dozens of areas, took 1 or 2 inches of tape, pressed them onto the Shroud all over the place. Then he peeled them off and prepared them under a slide. And when you look under a slide, you can see things that you can't see with the naked eye. These are pollen grains. Now, that's a pollen grain from a scanning electron microscope, over 1,000 magnification. I think that's over 5,000 magnification. Every pollen grain matches up uniquely to a plant. So by looking at those pollen grains, you can tell, oh, this comes from this plant and that plant. And it also tells you what time of year, because pollen grains only come out at certain, pollen for different plants, some in spring, some in fall. These happen to be spring, March and April. And he identified over 200 pollen grains. There were 49 different kinds, and 13 of those species are unique to Jerusalem. There were also some from Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, and some across France as well, in Italy. So from this, he concluded, those pollen grains give us a trail from Jerusalem to Turin, Italy, where the Shroud is at today. And one of the more mysterious features of the Shroud is that it contains 3D information. I think everybody can see the face here, and that came from taking an instrument looking at this area here. So when you get a picture of that, it looks like this. Then if you put this underneath that instrument, that is called a VP8 image analyzer. It was developed by NASA. It went around the Earth and satellite. They were mapping pictures because it measures light intensities. And by measuring light intensities, they can get the contours and topography. So that NASA could use this for that type of work. But if you put any other picture, be it black and white or color, under the VP8, it looks worse, because pictures have color and shapes. Pictures do not contain light intensity information, but the Shroud does. And so what this is telling us is that some type of light event caused different light intensities that are depicted by showing these contours, such that those body parts that were in closest contact with the cloth are raised, like the beard and the nose, the eyebrows, and those that are further away are sunken back. This is true not only for the face, but for the entire body. And there's actually a 3D model that's on the campus of the United States Air Force Academy. It used to be in the basement down here. It is now at St. Francis Catholic Church in Colorado Springs. That chapel has been under renovation for over 5 years now. I don't know when they're going to get it done, but they found some asbestos in it, and they used to have a model down there. But it was this picture that inspired the Air Force Academy physics professor, Dr. John Jackson, to pursue this shroud study that took place in 1978. Perhaps you heard of it. It was in National Geographic in 1981. So people ask, well, where did they first find the shroud? We'll begin. And on Easter morning, I invite you to read that. I've highlighted yellow here, wrappings, plural. There's something more than one here, isn't there? What might they have seen? Perhaps Peter and John saw something like this. The shroud, and then this long strip that I told you about was used to wrap around the outside of it. Can you see it there? And the headcloth. 3 things are present there. We talked about the shroud. Let's move on to that side strip. Along the shroud, there is a seam right here. That's about 3 inches from the top. And it had been removed at one time, and it was typical for them to peel off that seam, wrap it around the body, and with the grade school kids the other day, we had a person on the table, and we wrapped them as Jesus so they could see that. It takes an extra 5 minutes, and to save time, I didn't do that with you. Plus, this table's only about 18 inches wide, and I didn't want anybody falling off, all right? But in any event, I think you can see it just clear as a bell there. See that seam? Goes all the way across. And like I say, spiral around the body 3 times. And then someone sewed that back on. And we don't know who, but perhaps later on Easter, that morning or that afternoon, someone gathered up the shroud and this long seam and the headcloth and took it back to the upper room. And it was sewn back on. And we don't know who did that. My own personal opinion is I can't think of anybody more likely to have done it than the Blessed Mother, because mothers do that kind of thing. This long side seam makes sense because you need some way of keeping it on the body. Jews did not wrap the body like a mummy. That was the Egyptians. Lots of tiny pieces tightly wrapped around the arms and the legs. Jews to this day still wrap these bodies as they've been doing for thousands of years. All right, so we talked about the shroud, the side seam. What about the headcloth rolled up in a place by itself? We think this may be that headcloth. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's 33 inches by 21 inches, and we can see blood stains and fluids on it, but we don't see any image on it. And that's because we don't believe it was on the body at the moment of image formation. So where did this come from? Well, in Jewish culture, blood is considered part of the body. And so as our Lord hung on the cross and was dying, and perhaps even passed away, the blood was coming out of his nose and his mouth. His body was dripping onto the ground. So it would have been very logical for someone to put a little ladder up there and wrap his head with a headcloth to catch this blood so they could bury it with the body. Just like if you had a loved one that had some fingers or toes amputated, you want those fingers and toes buried with the body. Jews considered blood to be part of the body. So he's taken down from the cross. Actually, we don't know how long the headcloth was on him. Was it 15 minutes? Was it an hour and a half? Joseph of Arimathea gets permission from Pilate to take the body down. When they take the body down, this headcloth is on it, and they carry him from Golgotha to the Holy Sepulchre, or the Edicule, where his body was laid. And we believe that stone in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that spot now. It's only about 50 yards between those two. They are under the same roof today. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over those areas. And at one end of the building, you will see this is where Calvary was. At the other end is the Edicule. It just holds a handful of people. It's got the stone there, we believe, was the spot where the resurrection took place. Now, in about the 7th century, the Syrians were attacking, the Persians were attacking. And so someone took this headcloth out of the Holy Land, and it made its way to Spain. It went through a few cities on its way. And it's been in Oviedo, Spain ever since the year 711 AD. And there's some neat coincidences between this Sudarium and the shroud. On the right, these are blood stains from the shroud. These are the blood stains from the Sudarium. They're very pixelated because the scientists that did this study wanted to quantify what is the overlap. Is there a matching here? And when you overlap these two sheets, there are many locations where the blood stains overlap perfectly. And they both have the same type of blood, AB blood, more common in the Middle East, maybe 10 or 15%. In this country, it's about 4%. So the blood type matches, the shapes match, and the pollen grains from the face are found on the Sudarium. And the travertine aragonite soil that was on his nose is found on the Sudarium. So this is considered first-class scientific information. Scientists agree that the Sudarium and the Shroud had to have wrapped the same person at the same time to get all those consistencies. So where did the Shroud go after the resurrection? Well, it's not surprising that we don't have a lot said about the Shroud, because if its whereabouts have been advertised, like in the Acts of the Apostles or some other place, look at what we've got, Jesus rose from the dead. It would have been confiscated. Remember, the first 3 centuries, we had nothing but martyrs. It was kept secretly hidden, wasn't advertised. But we do have a couple of hypotheses from other non-biblical sources. We know that in 44 AD, there was a persecution, and the disciples fled from Jerusalem. This was most likely when the Shroud left. Antioch was the first Christian community where we were called Christians. Very early Christian community. That's where St. Luke wrote his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Now, we think it was there for about 5 centuries, perhaps hidden above a gate that was above the city. There was a flood and an earthquake that went through, and in repairing the gates, they may have rediscovered it. We can't say for certain. But in the year 540, there was an attack. The Persians were attacking Antioch and Edessa, and tradition holds that the bishop of Antioch, Bishop Ephraimius, who was responsible for church property, took the Shroud on horseback to central Turkey for safekeeping, and he planned on coming back to get it someday, but he died in 544. So it may have stayed there. Now, Constantinople was a very important city. This was the Rome of the Eastern Church. Rome is over here, but back in those days, people didn't travel like they did. So Constantinople was a very important place, and in the royal palace, there were literally hundreds of bones and relics from saints there. And it's possible it was brought there in 574. Now, this is the work of Dr. Jack Marquardt. There is another possibility. A British researcher named Ian Wilson believes that the Shroud went from Jerusalem to Edessa and then arrived there in 944. It's an open question, but we do believe we have enough evidence to show it was in Constantinople. Now, I think most people have a familiarity with that picture. It's called the Pantocrator, or Christ ruler over all. And when you compare it with the Shroud, there are many, many similarities. For example, this cheek is not the same as that cheek. They're asymmetrical. There's a ratio between these pupils of 1.0 to 1.26. There's this line across the sternum. And when you look at the Shroud, you see that same little line coming through here. The only difference is the eyes are open and there the eyes are closed. Now, in a court of law, if 2 images have 40 points of congruence, that's enough to prove they're the same person. Dr. Alan Wanger and others have compared these 2 pictures, and they found over 150 points of congruence between this picture and this one. So we don't know who the artist was for that, but whoever they were, they had to have been looking at the Shroud to get all those things to match up so well. They've actually done a probability study on it. It's like 10 to the 18th that you just randomly get all those correct. And there's also, by the way, this picture was found at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses got the 10 Commandments. This picture was found there in St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's Monastery is a Catholic monastery. It's been at the foot of Mount Sinai for over 15 centuries. And this picture was found there, and it becomes the prototype for all the other ones that flow from all the 24 Catholic churches and the Orthodox churches, 15 Orthodox churches. There's also a theological message here. Think of the 2 attributes of God. The right hand is raised in blessing. That is the mercy of God. What's the other attribute of God? He's holding the book. That is the law. That is the justice of God. So the mercy and justice of God are conveyed in one illustration without using any words. It speaks to every language. And one last thing before we move on is if you compare that eye to that eye, perhaps you can see the artist was trying to show us the contrast between the mercy of God and the justice of God. So the next time you see that picture, you'll see that meaning there. Perhaps you hadn't seen that before. We're going to jump ahead to the 12th century. This is called the Prey manuscript, or the Hungarian Prey Codex. It's 10 inches by 6 inches. It is the oldest surviving parchment in the country of Hungary, and it's currently in a museum library in Budapest. The top picture is showing us Good Friday. Right hand over the left, which is what we see on the shroud. There's the cloth, only 4 fingers. We only see 4 fingers over here as well. But down below is where the real details are at. Here's Easter morning. The angel is pointing to the cross. The body is gone. Those red crosses represent bloodstains. There's the 3 women arriving at the tomb. There might have been that long strip that was around it. But if you look inside that circle, there's a couple of other details. Remember I showed you the 3-in-1 herringbone weave, the stair-step pattern? This is the only recorded picture in history that shows a 3-in-1 herringbone weave. The artist of this had to have been looking at the shroud because those 4 holes, when you compare them to the shroud, it's a pretty good match. And those 4 holes are found right here, 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 and here. This is going to tell us something. So here's the shroud, and there's the 4 areas I was responding to. That's shaped like an L, isn't it? This is an upside down L. So if you fold it down, this was folded down over the top of that. Mirror image. And if you compare this one, this is a backward 7. Here's a forward 7. It would be folded this way. So when you do that, it looks like this. You fold it in half once. Now it's 8 cubits by 1 cubit. Fold it in half again. Now it's 4 cubits by 1 cubit. And that's what it looks like. And I want to show you that here. This sheet is 4 cubits by 1 cubit. It is the same size as that, but I have folded it as you see up here. So does that make sense? So this is the shroud folded. Now why would you put it in this length? We never have anything in history showing us the shroud being put in a box that's over 7 feet long. You wouldn't store it this way. It just makes more sense to fold it up and put it in something more convenient. Well, it's been proposed that look how nicely this fits over an altar. Now today they gave me a table that's about 6 feet. An altar might have been 3 feet to 6 feet long, but it fits very nicely over that altar. And the holes are right in the middle. Well, let's imagine that it's being venerated with incense. You got a bowl burning coals, and they're swinging the thurible, and boom, it hits the side, and 4 big coals spill out, and 20 smaller ones, and they brush it off real quick, but not before it burned through all 4 layers in less than 2 seconds. That could explain these holes that we see. And I had a priest raise his hand one time and said, that happened to me once. I was incensing the altar, and he bumped it, if you're swinging it, and it spilled out. I went to one of your Byzantine liturgy masses. You have a Byzantine church here in Wisconsin, one of the pilgrimage sites. I went to Byzantine liturgy, which is fully Catholic. It's legitimate Catholic. It's not Orthodox. And that guy was swinging the thurible like a yo-yo. He was so skilled, I could not believe it. Anyway, so if you spill those on it, that might account for these holes you see. And we can even show you another detail of this. I can do it up here because it's a little bit better. This one would have burned through first. This was on the top. That's the most damage. This would have burned through second. A little bit less damage. This would have burned third. And that would have burned through last. All right, well, that explains how these holes may have gotten there and the fold and everything. But what's it doing on the altar? Think of every Catholic Mass you've ever attended. Right after the priest's sermon, he goes over to the altar and begins the liturgy of the Eucharist. The first thing he does, he takes that white linen corporal, that thing with 9 white squares, and unfolds it and sets it down. This is found in all 24 Catholic churches today, and it's found in all 15 of the Orthodox churches. So we believe that when the apostles dispersed by 44 AD, this practice was standardized. Everybody did it because ever since that time, for 2,000 years, we've got this linen corporal thing in all the Catholic churches and all the Orthodox churches. So what does it represent? The linen cloth recalls the tablecloth of the Last Supper. So when transubstantiation takes place, he said, this is my body. That's exactly what Jesus did on Holy Thursday night. This is my body over a tablecloth. That corporal, Latin for corpus, means that. Also, on Easter morning, we had a linen shroud discovered, the resurrection. So from Holy Thursday night to the resurrection, we call that the Triduum. The Triduum. And in our Masses, when that's unfolded and he said, this is my body, we enter into that moment. Christ died once for all. It doesn't happen again. It happened once. But because it atones for all sins, past, present, and future, that moment is once and everlasting. For non-Catholics, it was a moment that was once and ended. That's one of the differences between Catholicism and other religions, is that in our Mass, when we celebrate the Eucharist, every time we enter into that moment, it might help at the next Mass you go to when the priest says, this is my body which will be given up for you. Imagine this face on your priest, because that's who's saying those words. And the same thing when the chalice, all right, becomes the blood of Christ. It's the same thing. If you can imagine Christ saying those things, and that was the face of your priest, you're in that moment. And it makes such a difference in Mass, because Christ told his apostles, do this in memory of me. And that's what we've been doing for about 2,000 years. I didn't used to spend so much time on this, but I think it's so important, because you'll hopefully get two things out of this talk. Number one, you'll know more when you leave here than you knew an hour ago. And number two, the next Mass you attend, that is so much more special. This is an image of Christ, but the Eucharist is Christ, the person. And so this is like Scott Hahn used an analogy, the menu. If you went to a restaurant, you wouldn't just look at the menu and go, I want this and this, that looks good, and then leave. You're missing out. No, you came there for the meal. And so this points us to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It might be one of the reasons why he gave it to us, to show us the resurrection and also to make the Eucharist more real. Okay, we go to 1201, Constantinople. They took inventories. And Nicholas Meserites, he recorded all of the bones and relics and things they had in the royal palace. And among them, he included the burial syndones of Christ, the cloth of Christ. These are of linen. So we know it's still in Constantinople in 1201. Then comes 1204, which was the sack of Constantinople. And that's another story in itself. But we have an eyewitness account from a French knight who was present in Constantinople in April of 1204, who witnessed the shroud being venerated. On Fridays in Lent, we do the stations. What would you do if you had the shroud? You'd do something with it. And he saw what they did with it. He witnessed it being raised up. He said, the features of our Lord, which stood up straight every Friday, so the features of our Lord could be plainly seen. Now there's three things going on here. A through G, those are fold marks in the shroud. And they find this out by using a process called raking light, R-A-K-I-N-G. You send light across the cloth, you can see the folds. So these are the folds. And when Dr. Jackson did this, we know the shroud is folded in this way. Imagine that's a block of wood. And it's folded along those lines such that it could be pulled up out of a box and venerated on Fridays. And it doesn't take too much imagination to imagine, a couple of candles burning on each side as this veneration took place. After this, the shroud goes missing for about 150 years. And we call this the missing years. And there's a lot of interest in this. There's three possible theories on this. I'm going to skip over them and keep going so we can cover more information here. But in 1355, the shroud turns up in Lire to a French knight named Geoffrey de Charnay. His bishop gives him permission to display it, and over 40,000 people came to see it. It hadn't been seen for 150 years. So they asked him, where did you get this? And his response was, it was freely given. So if that's true, then it eliminates any accusation about simony. Simony is when you use money to try and buy something that's sacred. Actually, the apostles, there was a guy named Simon that saw Peter cure somebody. He said, I want to do that. Let me buy that from you. And Peter called him down, and the Lord's sacraments are not for sale. So you don't buy stuff. In any event, it's displayed there. And for the next century, his family had it, and they gave it to the House of Savoy in 1453. His great-granddaughter, Margaret, gives it to the House of Savoy. This was a dynasty. They had castles all over the place. It started in the 10th century, and the last king of Italy was 1946, shortly after World War II. So this was a dynasty that lasted 10 centuries. They could protect it very well. Now, on the night of December 4th, 1532, while I was in that church in Chambéry, there was a mysterious fire that broke out. And that was when the silver casket melted and a triangular piece burned through all those layers and produced those patches you see here. Now, in 1578, Duke Filbert of Savoy took the shroud across the French Alps into Torino, or Turin, Italy. That was the site of the 2006 Olympic Games. The ones coming up here in a week or two are going to be in Milan, Italy. And he gives it to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which was completed in 1594, and that's where it has been ever since. And that is why it was displayed in 1978. The 400th anniversary of the shroud coming to Turin resulted in the public display we saw in 1978. And that is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist right there. The first photograph taken was by this man. He's a lawyer by trade, but he's a good photographer. Seconda Pia, May 24th, he took a picture of the shroud. And as he developed his glass plate and silver nitrate, this image emerged. And can you imagine the shock? And I'm the first person to see Christ's face in 2,000 years. He nearly dropped the glass plate. But this is where world interest in the shroud really began, with that picture. 18 centuries down, one to go. Shroud of Turin Research Project. That is Dr. John Jackson there. He is a physics professor, officer of the United States Air Force Academy. As it comes off display, he had built up a team of 33 scientists that were going to try and answer the question, how was the image formed? And they had literally tons of equipment. And as it comes off display, from October 8th to October 12th, they studied the shroud around the clock, 5 or 10 or 15 scientists working on it all the time for 120 consecutive hours. And here's some of the places they were from. I won't read that to you. There's the atomic bomb, jet propulsion is NASA. These were top-notch experts in everything from anatomy to x-rays and everything in between. And they weren't trying to prove the resurrection. They were trying to answer the question, how was the image formed? There were only 3 Catholics on the team. There were 3 Jews. There were some Protestants, agnostics. There were atheists on the team. And people ask, were any of them converted? Yes. Many of them were converted by this. I went in skeptical and couldn't find a natural explanation, so they started to consider maybe there's an unseen reality I've never considered before. Not all of them, but many of them. So for the next 3 years, they published their data in 20 professional scientific peer-reviewed journals. And they could not answer the question, how was the image formed? But they did come up with these 3 statements, and I share these with you. This is probably one of the most important slides you'll see. No paints, pigments, or dyes are found on the image-bearing thread fibers. There's no stuff to make up the image. Now, on my replica, it's ink. This was run through a 4-foot printer in Ventura, California. There's ink on this, but the real shroud is much fainter. We can't replicate the superficiality. But there's no stuff to make up the image. Something dehydrated them, perhaps a radiation event, so that those fibers, are decomposing at a different rate than the surrounding threads. For that reason, and for many others, the 3D nature, the superficial nature of it, we know this is not the work of an artist. And thirdly, there's no chemical or physical methods that can account for this image. There's no natural process. Otherwise, we could wrap a body in a shroud and get a copy of it, right? We don't have. They've tried that. They've tried burying pigs in a blanket, all kinds of things. They discovered many shrouds in Egypt, even linen ones, but none of them have any image on them. 1983. This was the last of the Savoys when Italy voted for a new form of government. The King of Italy, King Umberto II, moved to Portugal, and in his will, he deeded the shroud to the Pope. So now, for perhaps the first time since Easter morning, the shroud is in the possession of the successor of Peter, who at that time was John Paul II, then it was Benedict, then it was Francis, and now it's Leo XIV. This is the Cathedral of John the Baptist, and it is on fire in Turin, Italy. And normally the shroud is kept below those flames. By the way, it happened on April 11th, Good Friday. What a coincidence, a Good Friday fire. Well, what happened was, a few days before this fire, they had taken the shroud from underneath the altar and moved it down the side of the church and anchored it into the stone wall in a bulletproof case, because they were going to put some scaffolding to work on the ceiling above the altar. And so as the fire is raging, there's a fireman, Mario Trematore. He takes a sledgehammer. I don't know if he pounded that thing 50 times or 300 times, but it's not plexiglass. It's very thick, bulletproof glass. He eventually gets a crack in it. They get a hole big enough, and after midnight, on Holy Saturday morning, after midnight, they rush the shroud out of the cathedral. At this point, it's rolled up like a poster. in that case about 4.5 feet long. And the next day, they unfolded the shroud to see if there's any damage from the fire. And fortunately, the shroud was not damaged, but for the next year, the shroud's whereabouts were kept secret because they were concerned someone was trying to destroy it. It was thought that that fire was caused by arson. This was the most recent display in 2015. Many people expected it to be displayed in 2025 because Benedict, when he was Pope, said it would. But of course, he stepped down. But under Pope Francis, it was not displayed in 2025. Pope Leo has recently mentioned interest in the shroud. When he was flying back from Constantinople a few months ago, he said, I want to see the shroud in Turin. So you may hear about that in the news in 2026. It's up to him to decide when it will be displayed again. It's most likely going to happen in 2033 for sure, because that would be the 2000th anniversary of the resurrection. And it's possible it could be displayed before then, but that's up to Pope Leo. This is what it looks like today. If you go to Turin, Italy, in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, this is the main altar, and just to your left is this side altar. The seam you see here are two extremely heavy bullet-resistant glass panels, very heavy, and the shroud is in an aluminum reliquary. It's not folded up, and you can get within 10 feet of it and pray, but you can't see it. And it's got controlled temperature, humidity, a very elaborate security system, 24-hour guard. They've removed all the air, so it's argon, which doesn't react with anything. So people ask the question, how is the image formed? In the last 130 years, there have been 10 hypotheses suggested, and they fall into 3 groups. Here they are. Did the body just do this alone? Like, did the body exude a gas? Those are the names associated with those hypotheses. Was it the work of an artist in some way? Did someone invent photography back in the 12th or 13th century? Was it a hot statue? Things like that. Or was it the result of a radiation event? John Jackson and Giulio Fonte from Italy. This is electrons, that's photons of light. I want you to know that all of these have been thoroughly studied. And this was done with something called the truth table. And you can get this across the top. These are the 10 hypotheses. Here's some traits from the cloth, the superficiality of it. Those X's mean that hypothesis can't explain that image, the superficiality of it. So the X means it fails. So X's mean these all fail. So these have to be eliminated, and all of these have to be eliminated. An open box means it could explain it. Question mark means it might. I wanted you to know there's actually 11 others. So there's 17 traits. We won't take time to go through this, but I've gone through all 170 of these boxes. There's a whole appendix in here, and I've spent time on the airplane reading about each one of these, about why there's an X there and why there's not one there. But I wanted just to show you that these have been thoroughly studied. My point in this is radiation. Artist theories are no longer considered worth pursuing. So the only area in science that's trying to answer the question, how is the image formed, is looking at radiation, either by neutrons, electrons, or photons of light, that type of radiation. Now, John Jackson looked at the 17 traits. This is back in 1989. And after looking at those, he came up with what's called the radiation fall-through hypothesis. And it does explain all 17 traits, but it's still an open question. He suggests this, that perhaps the mechanism, so we believe that the cause was the resurrection, and the effect is that. But what's the mechanism? Is it natural? Is it supernatural? He suggested that if the mechanism for this superficial image is that if there was a burst of light from the body, and the body simultaneously became mechanically transparent, if it went from matter to energy. The body's there one moment, a burst of light, now it's gone. Then the cloth, imagine this is the cloth over the nose, would collapse through that area, the body's no longer there, pulling out at the sides as it did so, and that would result in a vertically aligned 3D image with no side images, because anything more than a couple millimeters from the body doesn't show up. And that gets us back to one of the slides I showed you earlier. Now, we all know, I'm going to back up here a second, mechanically transparent. We all understand what that means. How did Jesus appear to the apostles on Easter night? They're locked in the upper room in fear, and Jesus comes among them. Well, how could he do that if the door's locked? Well, if we accept on faith that Jesus came among them, then we've accepted that his body was mechanically transparent. It was a resurrected body, no longer subject to the laws of nature. So if his body had that characteristic on Easter night, when did that moment begin? If that moment began at the instant of the resurrection, that would explain this 3D vertically aligned image with no side images and a cloth-to-body distance correlation that we see on the shroud. That's actually a 16-page paper in a few seconds for you, but I'm trying to get as much through I can, so we're going to have time for questions very shortly here. I invite you to take a look at that, Pope Benedict. Every Sunday we recite the Nicene Creed. I believe in all that is seen and unseen. The seen we can get through reason. Science quantifies it. The unseen is those things that can't be quantified. God exists as the Trinity, heaven, hell, and purgatory. We have an immortal soul. The existence of angels. These are all realities that can't be explained by science. So science is limited. Okay? Science has a competency within that which can be quantified. But the other realities that exist are beyond the competency of science to explain. Just as you and I can't explain the Trinity, nor can science. This is Bishop Michael Sheridan. And what I want to share with you is some words he shared at the St. Louis conference in 2014. He said this: faith is about more than probability. The martyrs did not die because they thought that Christ was probably the Savior of the human race. No, they died in the certainty that he is. The difference between life and death is absolute. And to be so certain of something as to pay for it with one's own death is to be very certain indeed. Our faith rests on the reality of the resurrection and not on the authenticity of the shroud. But if it is authentic, it's very precious. And what has God given it to us for? Well, a week after Easter, Thomas said, I won't believe until I put my hand in his side. And then he did. He said, my Lord and my God. Perhaps John and Peter saw something like this, and that was enough to convince them that our Lord had risen because that side strip is still in place. If that was enough for them, what have you and I been given? We've been given so much more to have our hope in the resurrection. Okay, at this point, I'm going to take some questions. And John, where are you at? You're going to read them back? Great, you are so on top of things.
Thank you, sir. So are you. Very impressive. Let's put our hands together for Mr. Jim Bertrand. Really a world-class presentation here with an astonishing amount of slides that you've got through in an astonishing amount of time. So thank you very much.
I was impressed with their attention. This is the same talk I gave to the Catholic Medical Association a couple of years ago, and you guys got it.
Awesome. Okay, if anybody wants to bring back a question, we'll do the best that we can. We've got a few here already to work through. Thank you very much. This person writes in, lots of evidence and correlation, but how does this show, if you could put succinctly, how does this show that Jesus is God, or what evidence does it give to a skeptic? If you could boil it down to a point or two. In other words, how should this affect
could another way of being saying is why? Why do we have this? Is that what you're asking? Maybe why? What's the evidence of this? Okay. Well, all the evidence that matches up with it. Let's see, I got that slide here. Oh, I can do this, yeah. You've got this much evidence saying it's authentic. And over here was 3 or 4 objections. One of them was the carbon dating of 1988, and I can address that if you want. Other people believe it's a pareidolia. A pareidolia is just, it happens to be a random shape that you recognize. You can look at a cloud and say, I think I kind of see an elephant in that cloud. There are those who believe this is just a random image that is there. It's just like a cloud has this. Or other people believe it's bacteria. Bacteria just happen to be growing in there. Other people believe it's ancient aliens that are coming back, and that's going to be their salvation. So there are some objections from that. But my response to that would be, why did Christ leave us this? And what we're seeing is conversions. We don't have a single documented physical miracle from the shroud. You don't see blind people touching it all of a sudden. Lourdes and Fatima, perhaps. What we are seeing is conversions. I've met this man, Bill Lotto. He lives in New York, got a great accent. And he was converted. There's some other ones. This man here is from the UK, David Rolfe. He was an atheist. He's made 2 movies about the shroud now. And he even made a $1 million challenge a few years ago, 2023, in England, came over to this country, and he says, if anybody can replicate the shroud with the 3D image, with the superficiality, I'll give you $1 million. And the silence has been deafening. So here's an atheist that was converted. It's a typical thing. Every week I go through 30 to 50 different YouTube videos and scientific papers and things like that. And I read the comments, I look at the chats, and this is very typical. Here's another one. I was an atheist obsessed with science, non-biblical evidence. I believe it is who he said it is. Here's another one. I'm a Protestant, and I too believe the shroud is the authentic shroud of the risen Christ. Here's another Protestant. I've spoken to Protestants that have converted, by the way. I watched a podcast with Father Dalton, and that same day God softened my heart and led me back to the Catholic Church. So reverts are coming back. Protestants are being converted. Atheists. There are also Muslims and Jews. This is a Muslim. He runs a ministry down in Australia, and he was converted by the shroud, the Holy Face. Where was that image at? He was sitting in front of a tabernacle, and he was asking, okay, who's God? Jesus, are you God or not? And this image manifested itself in front of the tabernacle. And that's a personal experience you and I might not have. But he took the ball with it, and now he's got his own ministry. His name, Raish, is his name. Here's some other ones. Barry Schwartz was the photographer for the shroud. Even after he believed it was authentic, he said that, well, maybe it was caused by a natural cause. He had a lot of credibility because being Jewish, people ask him, they know he's not trying to convert them, see. He told his Jewish friends, I think it's authentic. He just didn't believe it was a supernatural cause. He thought it was a natural event that hasn't been described yet. I've been at his house a couple times, spent hours sitting in his living room with him. 2 summers ago, I wanted to speak with him, but he was dying. And he said, I don't want to see anybody. And in June, I think, of 2024 was when he passed away. And I asked Russ Brialt, who was his good friend, I said, did Barry ever come around? And he sent me an email that said, Russ asked Barry, it was like a couple of days before he died, he says, so did you ever come to peace with the man on the shroud? And he goes, what else could I do? It's possible he may have converted at the end of his life. He wasn't evangelical about it, but he certainly had time to think about it. So that's my answer to that question. I'll go to some other ones now.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much. This person writes, is there any correlations between the shroud and Eucharistic miracles?
Yeah, the correlation between the shroud and Eucharistic miracles are all AB blood. 6 of them, they haven't all been tried. There have been over 160 in history, but 6 of them have been tested. Poland, Mexico, Lanciano, a couple others. But they all test out at AB blood, and the shroud tested AB blood. So there's a match there. In terms of healings, there's no healings from the shroud, but it certainly increases faith. And I would say along with the Eucharistic miracles is the Tilma of Guadalupe. Tilma of Guadalupe is a totally different item that doesn't have superficiality with it. But what was the result? From 1531 to 1541, there were 9 million Aztecs and Mexicans that converted from human sacrifice to Catholicism. So the shroud is for conversions. The Tilma of Guadalupe did the same thing. Next one.
Jesus at the center. Love it. This person writes in, well, you actually kind of answered that question. Father Michael Gately did a presentation on the shroud that showed the image of the shroud matches the image of divine mercy. Have you seen anything about that?
Yeah, the face on the shroud matching the image of divine mercy, that's a pretty good match there. And that was made, I think, in 1938 for Sister Faustina by an artist. There's a pretty good match between the divine mercy image and the shroud. Some people ask, there's a lot of AI images. Is there anyone that's better than the others? Just real quickly, I can show you one slide to answer that question. I just pulled 6 of them off the internet. Those are all artificial intelligence generated images. Notice they're all different. So they couldn't be correct. This is the original they're starting with. And so if you want to know what did Jesus look like, there it is. If you go to sindone.org, 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 it's an Italian website, you'll see the shroud, and you can zoom in and look at every square inch to your heart's desire. Sindone.org. I encourage you to do that. So what does Jesus look like? These are fabrications. They're all different. This is the original they're working from. Next. Yeah, John.
Give me 1 second here. Well, here, 2 came in similarly asked. Can you comment on the amount of radiation energy that would have been necessary to imprint on the Shroud of Turin? What would this look like practically?
This originated from a scientist, Dr. Lazzaro, in Italy, working for the Atomic Energy Commission. In his laboratory, they simulated, in order to get the superficiality, if it goes for a fraction of a second, it'll burn a hole in it. But it had to be very small time frame just to dehydrate it superficially. And he estimated it would be 40 nanoseconds. There's 1 billion nanoseconds in a second. So 40 nanoseconds